Have you ever thought about how the inner ear works? What if it doesn't work properly? Also, why do we feel dizzy once we've been upside down? And how do ballerinas keep dancing after having spun in circles over and over? This lesson is on how our inner ear functions to allow us to hear, as well as our sense of balance and proprioception, where our body is in space. So, when sound waves first enter the ear, they travel down the auditory canal, and our pinna again collects those sound waves from a larger area than if we just had an ear hole in the side of our head. Then the tympanic membrane vibrates, which is then going to vibrate our three ossicles in our middle ear, our malleus, our incus, and our stapes. The stapes is then connected to the oval window, and when the stapes moves, it causes the oval window to bulge in and out. This oval window is then going to cause the fluid in the inner ear to vibrate in a wave pattern, just like waves on the ocean. And it's going to put pressure on the cochlear duct. And inside the cochlear duct, we have that basilar membrane, where we have the organ of Corti. So pressure waves cause the basilar membrane to move up and down, which cause the little hairs on the organ of Corti to bend against the tectoral membrane, which will sit on top. So as those hair cells bend, the small nerves that are connected to the base of the hairs are stimulated, and it's going to carry that information to the auditory nerve, which is then going to flow to the brain, to the temporal lobe, where that information will be interpreted. When we're listening to sound, we can determine the sound intensity, which depends on the number of neurons and the frequency of firing. So do those neurons fire often? And how many? So the louder a sound is, often the more neurons will fire, and those neurons will fire more quickly. Pitch, is it a high note or a low note, depends on which hair cells are responding, because each hair cell responds to only one frequency. And because each hair cell responds to only one frequency, that is why ear safety is important. Because if those certain hair cells die, they can't be replaced. So we have small muscles in our ear that help protect our hearing. So when we're around loud noises, the muscles on the malleus contract to restrict these intense movements. So our inner ear bones won't amplify the sound as much. Then a second muscle contracts, pulling the stapes away from the over window, limiting inner ear damage. But this happens when we have like continuous loud noises, such as like a lawnmower or a motorcycle, highway noise, things like that, that our body is around and the muscles have time to react. But it's not effective with sudden loud noises because this response takes time, even if it's just a reflex. So things like a gun firing or an explosion, which is why that sudden noise can cause damage to the inner ear. You may hear whining, or you may have a hard time kind of identifying all the different sounds. Now, this can cause damage to the inner ear, specifically hairs in the organ of Corti. And if those hairs are damaged enough and that they die and fall out, we can no longer hear those certain pitches. You'll notice there might be some not long-term damage necessarily to your ears, unless it's a very common occurrence. But if you go to a concert and the next day kind of everything sounds a little duller because your muscles in your ear are still kind of protecting your inner ear from the noise from the night before. So now we're going to look at the mechanics of balance. So if you've been on a roller coaster, or you've spun in a circle a lot, or if you do flips, how can you tell your body's position in the air? So we have a utricle and saccule in our inner ear, as well as semicircular canals. And these are filled with both fluid as well as sensory hairs. The utricle and the saccule also contain small calcium stones called otoliths, or ear stones. And with these three structures, we're able to tell the movement of our head along one plate. Is our head vertical or is our head horizontal? Because those little otoliths they respond to gravity because they're rocks. So if we tilt our head sideways, that little ball will roll to the bottom, bending those hairs, telling us we've turned our head sideways. And If we move our head back to vertical, that little ball will roll back down, sending us a sensory message as well. The semicircular canals contain sensory hairs, which are just going to be bent by the movement of the fluid surrounding them. Now, if you've ever been in a pool or a hot tub or a bath, and you've swirled the water in one direction for 10 to 30 seconds or whichever, and then all of a sudden when you stop manually moving that water still continually wants to move. So this can happen in the semicircular canals. So one canal is able to detect bending forward or bending back, another detects bending to the right or bending to the left, as well as a third detects turning motion because that fluid will be moving in the ears. And if that fluid is moving once we're still, that's how we sometimes get that dizzy sensation. So here we can see the 3 different semicircular canals, and you can see how they're put in different planes. And this is how they can detect different types of motion. So static equilibrium is going to involve movement along one plane, so just horizontal or vertical. We can see in the center there the utricle and saccule, which are going to contain those little otoliths, which a little rock will roll and stimulate the little hair cells. And then you can also see our 3 semicircular canals in different positions. So dynamic equilibrium provides information during movement. So while you're moving, that balance is maintained by those 3 semicircular canals. And rotational stimulus, like spinning or being on a roller coaster, can cause that fluid to move, bending the cilia attached to those hair cells. Once those cilia are bent, they're going to stimulate a nerve impulse and carry that to the brain. And then again, that rapid continuous movement can cause motion sickness. So if you've ever done a relay where maybe you've put your head down on a baseball bat and you've spun around and around, and then you've gone to try and kick or throw a ball, because our body is responding to that spinning fluid, while our eyes and the rest of our body is trying to run in a straight line. So that's why it's quite entertaining to watch people tip over or all kind of go off to the side, because their brain still says, well, I think you're still spinning because that fluid in your ear is spinning. Now, dancers will train their brain as well as their body by it's known as marking. So they'll pick a spot in the distance, and every time they spin, their body will spin in a constant pace, but their head will be still, slow, or still, fast, still, fast, so that they don't get that fluid to build up a motion pattern in their ears as much, allowing them to continue their dance without getting very, very dizzy. So we're going to finish up today with talking about other sensory receptors. So all stimuluses come in the form of energy. And our sensory receptors convert one form of energy, whether it's pressure, kinetic, thermal, into another form. So our electrical energy of our nerve impulse. And we have very highly specific sensory neurons that have their own threshold potential of whether or not they should fire. So this table demonstrates the different types of receptors, the stimulus, and then the information provided. So we have a few different types of chemical receptors that determine our taste and smell. We have mechanical receptors for pressure, body position, or proprioception, as well as balance. Audio receptors, which need sound energy to stimulate action potential. We have visual receptors that need light stimulus to stimulate an action potential. And then thermoreceptors, which need a change in temperature to stimulate an action potential. When we look at our skin, we can see we have different types of nerve endings that will tell us about pressure, touch, and several different types of touch receptors, maybe whether it was a pinch, whether it was a slide, whether it's at the end of our different hair cells, because we can tell that different types of touch feel differently. We have human taste receptors are within the taste buds of our tongue. And different places of our tongue have different types of sensory receptors. So we can tell sweet, salty, sour, bitter, or umami. That's like things like in cheese and soy sauce. It's a very satisfying flavor enhancer. Olfactory cells are located within the nasal cavity. And this is stimulated by airborne chemicals. And then that information goes to the frontal lobe of the brain, and again to our temporal lobe as well. Okay. If we have clogged nasal passages, this reduces the effectiveness of our olfactory cells. And just for fun, if you end up plugging your nose when you're eating something that's very strong tasting, especially before you put it in your mouth, you have a very difficult time tasting what it is. And then the instant you let go of your nose, all that flavor kind of explodes in your mouth. So here we have our olfactory bulb and our olfactory sensors in our sinus cavity, and that will be carried to the brain. So for the very last slide, we're going to talk about how sensory reception is converted into perception. So those sensory receptors, once they reach their threshold level, will send a nerve impulse or a sensation. And once it reaches the cerebrum, or that more conscious part of our brain, we perceive what's happening. We perceive that there's sunlight on our face, either because of the brightness or because of the temperature. And everybody has a unique perception depending on how our cerebral cortex interprets the meaning of that information. So like, do we all see exact same color? Do we all hear the exact same sound? Do we all feel the exact same temperature? So it's very individual. And our brain can often multitask in order to process this information quickly, but sometimes it does not get integrated precisely, which is why we don't always perceive exactly what the environment is showing us, which we can see in things like optical illusions. So our brain can be tricked by the environment because things aren't being processed exactly perfectly. That is the end of our lessons on the ear. Thanks for joining. Catch you next time. Bye.